it increases sexual pleasure dramatically. Like, people are taking it in order to increase orgasm.
Is it either you're feeling really good, or you're getting what you want out of it, or you're in critical condition?
The amount of G that you would need extra over and above the sort of dose that's making you feel pretty good and pretty sexy is relatively small.
This particular drug, from what I know about it, I haven't tried it myself, is something that people do on its own due to the fact that if you mix this with other things, there could be very severe consequences.
Yes and no. Oh, are we talking about G?
We're talking about G.
So I think it's true that people don't necessarily mix it with the kinds of drugs that we've been talking about, but it is often mixed with substances in the context of sexualized drug use, or I know you've previously done episodes on chemsex. So the milieu of chemsex is typically that people will use GBL, G, with a stimulant medicine, with a stimulant drug, so methadone, crystal methamphetamine. But also G is very, very typically taken with alcohol, and actually alcohol is one of the main things that is risky when it comes to G.
Wow.
So GBL is typically taken as a liquid, and one of the differences that it has to the drugs that we've been previously talking about is that it has this thing called what we call a narrow therapeutic index, and that means that you need a certain amount of drug for it to cause the effects, but the amount of drug that you need for it to cause the effects and for it to become toxic is very, very narrow. So it's very easy to overdose on G. And it's also much easier to overdose on G if you have other substances on board, particularly alcohol. And that's because alcohol works on similar receptors to G. So they all work on this system called GABA in the brain, or GABA. It's one of the neurotransmitters. And so the combination of alcohol and G together can be overly sedating, and can mean that you overdose, or you stop breathing, and it can be difficult to revive you. So I think that it is correct for people to think that G has more propensity to cause overdose perhaps than some of these other substances. They all have their own risks, as we've talked about, but the combination of G with any other sedative medication, so particularly alcohol and particularly benzodiazepines, so Valium, blues, the Xanax, those kind of things, are likely to shift you into overdose much quicker. So mixing G and alcohol and G or benzos is a really bad idea.
Am I right in thinking that G is growing in popularity not just in the chemsex scene but in the party scene, so it's being used more often now for people to just go out and dance?
Yeah, so we're definitely seeing shifts in the sort of user profile of people who are using G. If you'd asked me this a couple of years ago, I would have said it was almost exclusively used by men who have sex with men in the context of sexualized drug use or chemsex. We're starting to see shifts away from that into more straight people using it and coming in with problematic use, and some women. So it's been a very male-dominated drug, for want of a better word, in the past sort of 5-10 years. But we are seeing demographic shifts away from that. We're starting to see a different profile of G user than we had previously. But that happens a lot of times for lots of drugs, right? Drug trends shift. There are cultures and subcultures. There are changes in availability and demand. There are changes in popularity, affordability, and we see this a lot. But yeah, you're right. I think we are starting to see a shift or an expansion of G and GBL use into settings where it hasn't historically been.
And what is G? What is the liquid?
So the full name for G is GBL, or gamma-butyrolactone. Lots of people know it as paint stripper or paint thinner.
Is that a joke, or is that...
No, it is used in various paint-based products to...
so you can buy G in Homebase?
You can't buy G in Homebase, no. But it is... the chemicals that are derivatives of G and GBL are often used in products or can be used in products that are involved in sort of the world of painting and decorating. And people typically consume it as the liquid G. GBL, gamma-butyrolactone, is a prodrug of GHB, gamma-hydroxybutyrate, and it's changed almost instantaneously in the body into GHB. So you can also just take some people take regular GHB as tablets or as in other formulations. By and large, people who are taking G recreationally in the UK are taking it as a liquid and as the form GBL.
And why is it that this liquid over the past, you'd say, 10 years has entered the party circuit versus the 80s, the 90s? Why is it, who discovered it, who brought it to kind of the party scene?
Yeah, I mean, I think we don't necessarily know the sort of full origins, but it is a clear, colourless liquid, odourless, that is very easy to transport. So it probably went under the radar in terms of detection in bag searches and, those kind of things early doors. I think it's also not necessarily a product of just the substance itself, but like culture has changed dramatically over the past, 10, 15 years in terms of attitudes towards sex, attitudes towards substances, attitudes towards the LGBTQ plus population in general, availability of sex, Grindr, all of these things have changed simultaneously. And I suppose to sort of try and unpick one thing that has led to the rise of G would be silly, in that it's probably a combination of all of these things that have led to it being more accepted, more used, more available, more affordable within this setting. It's also, I mean, we can talk a little bit about the subjective effects of G, but like it increases sexual pleasure dramatically. Like people are taking it in order to increase orgasm, in order to facilitate what they consider to be improved sexual outcomes. So it's people take drugs for a reason. They like it. It does something to them. It's intoxicating, and so it dramatically, for some people, subjectively changes the experience of sex, both from a sort of similar to alcohol. I can chat to anyone. I'm much more attractive. I'm sexy, but also it increases orgasm and the actual effects of sex in general. So I think that's why it became particularly popular within the sort of sexualized drug use or chemsex milieu, and also, it became easier to, with apps like Grindr and with sort of changing social attitudes, parties with drugs became more commonplace, became more available within London. I mean, there's been a huge amount of work done on sort of trying to unpick the origins and the drivers for chemsex within the men who have sex with men community. And there are a whole bunch of reasons, one of which is the subjective effects of the drug, but also there's a bunch of other stuff in there as well.
And the way that you take it, as you said, you just drink it.
Yeah, you drink it typically in another liquid. Yeah, so you typically mix it with another liquid. Or some people dose it straight, so people can put it in syringes to measure it out, which you should do as a very good means of harm reduction. So figuring out exactly how much you're taking in terms of 0.5, 1, 2 mils. There was a trend, I don't know how true it is anymore, but people, the little fish soy sauce things that people got. So there used to be a trend of having G in those because it's a very measurable amount. I think that's slightly reduced over the last sort of couple of years. But yeah, or you will put it in another drink. So you will put your liquid G into a drink that you're having while you're out dancing, or you'll dose it. You'll dose it straight from a syringe.
And when you take G, what's happening to you? So
it works on similar effects as it works on a similar sort of receptor system as alcohol. So it's sedating. It's like I say, increasing this neurotransmitter called GABA. It's making you disinhibited. It's making you feel chilled out, happy, like I could talk to anyone, feeling pretty sexy, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and does it increase sexual arousal? Do you feel horny on G?
Increases arousal and increases pleasure related to orgasm and having sex.
And is it something that you need to top up during the evening, or can you do a bit of G at the start and it lasts for hours?
So it has a pretty short half-life, so most people who dose tend to redose after an hour or a couple of hours. What we would often advise, and this again goes for a lot of the substances, is, wait until you've experienced the effects and they're starting to wear off before you redose. Otherwise you end up building up and you put yourself at risk of overdose. And sometimes the best way to do that is by setting timing reminders on your phone, because if you are at a party having lots of different substances, you can lose track of time, and you might not remember that actually 15 minutes ago you did another 2 mils of G. So putting telephone reminders can be a really helpful way of sort of making sure you've got adequate spacing, and not increasing your risk of overdose due to accidentally forgetting that you dosed a couple of minutes ago or whatever. And similarly, using a measure, getting syringes with accurate measurement, to make sure that you're not just glugging and having nearish a mil or 2 mils or however many mils that you're using on that particular occasion. Because
are we talking in terms of G overdosing, which is something I hear about?
Yeah.
And is, I imagine, somewhat commonplace, is it?
I mean, it's not commonplace in the grand scheme of drug overdose deaths, because there's much more heroin out there, and there's many more people who use heroin than there are people who use G. However, within the community of men who have sex with men, and within the chemsex community, it is relatively common to have G overdoses, but that is a relatively small, tight-knit community in the sort of broader context of drug-related harm and drug-related death. But the fact that it's so isolated in a particular community obviously can wreak havoc and devastation on that particular community, and lots of gay men will know someone who has either had has used G, has had a negative experience with it, or may who have overdosed or passed away from it. Within the chemsex community, the kinds of drugs that are typically leading to the most drug-related harm, i.e. deaths, typically are G or GBL.
And is it that the sort of quantity that you would need to take, a lethal quantity, is very marginal?
Exactly, yeah. So that's what I was talking about with this narrow therapeutic index. So the amount of G that you would need extra over and above the sort of dose that's making you feel pretty good and pretty sexy is relatively small, and that window is even narrower if you've had alcohol or other kind of sedation medications.
That's quite terrifying, isn't it?
It's really terrifying, and I think, for people who've been at parties where these substances are used, there's obviously a lot more going on in terms of people overdosing, or being perhaps unable to consent to acts that if they weren't as intoxicated they might be able to. So there is a huge amount of risk, not only necessarily from the substance that's being used, but from the sort of environment in which you're in, particularly for people who aren't experienced users. So for people who are potentially trying this for the first or early times in their drug use journey. And that's why, again, buddies are great. Having someone that you know and trust there, if you're going to use these substances, and someone who has used these before, are sources of information that can help you reduce the risk. But in particular with G, because it can be very tricky to dose if you're not an experienced user, that's when you tend to see people who are having overdoses. You see more people in that circumstance having overdoses.
And is there less leeway for, I'm feeling a bit funny, I'm just going to cool off? Is it either you're feeling really good, or you're getting what you want out of it, or you're in critical condition?
It's a spectrum, but it's a much narrower spectrum than with some of the other substances. So it's much easier to be feeling great and suddenly have a little bit more and go over than it might be with some of the other substances. So it can switch, and you can overdose very quickly using something like G. And
finally on G, what is a very clear giveaway that something isn't quite right, either personally or observing someone else?
So I suppose, there's a thing called the G slouch or the G dribble, if people are slurring and not able to, control their faculties, if people are if people's breathing has stopped or has reduced to such a level that they are not able to maintain consciousness, would be concerning, and would probably require medical input, or at least, are you all right, mate? Someone sat next to them, making sure that they are continuing to breathe and that they're not, that they haven't overdosed.
Okay. And can you bring someone round from this?
Yeah, you could chat to them. I mean, you are likely to need medical attention, and getting an ambulance or getting them to A&E is probably very useful. However, any kind of things that you can do to keep them awake, keep them keep them conscious, are helpful. There's a few other sort of things when it comes to G that are useful. Like I say, always having a buddy who can tell people what you've taken is great. But if you're worried that that's not going to happen, writing G on your wrist is often helpful. So paramedics will look and see that if a person's got a letter G, that can be useful, so that they know, hang on, this person's on GBL. We might need to revive them. Yeah, and again, sort of setting phone reminders, making sure that you're adequately dosing, not sharing syringes, and not sharing materials that you're using with them.
So if we were to kind of reflect on the four that we spoke about, which one do you see has the most negative impact on people's lives in terms of admissions to hospitals, psychological effects, withdrawals? Which one of the four do you think is causing the most harm to LGBT society?
So I think harm is a, various people can conceptualize harm in various different ways, right? And so we can conceptualize harm as harm to the self and harm to others. And then within the sort of harm to self, is something directly lethal? Is it, is it going to cause chronic long-term mental health problems? Is it going to cause, short-term problems with my bladder or something? All of those things are harm. And then, you can think of it in much more wider context. So risk to society are actually, the ketamine, drug lords and trafficking of people is also a nature of harm. So I think it's not helpful sometimes just boiling things down to the number of hospital admissions or the number of deaths, which is what government statistics and as a researcher, some ways I often do as well. That being said, they are incredibly important to monitor and incredibly important to understand what's happening within these communities. I think all of the drugs that we've spoken about have huge potential to cause harm to a lot of individuals, and I wouldn't want to minimize anyone's experience of someone who's lost a loved one to any of these substances by ranking them, or saying that they have more or less harm. I think they all have potential for harm. They also all are, used by people who want to experience subjective effects that they find enjoyable or beneficial or helpful. So I don't think, these drugs are not inherently evil in and among themselves, and there are ways that we can discuss harm that are helpful to try and reduce or minimize or modify as much harm as we possibly can.
And in terms of long term, would you say that any of them in particular, say for example, we know smoking long term, as you get older, will definitely impact your health? Are any of these, every time you do one, it's kind of another domino down in terms of how this will affect you long term? I
mean, the more you use a substance in terms of frequency and quantity, the more likely you are to end up having some kind of problematic use with it, because, that's just the nature of the beast. If I were to stop drinking alcohol tomorrow, I'm very unlikely to have an alcohol use disorder going forward because I'm no longer using alcohol or I've reduced it. So all of these substances have propensity to lead to problematic use. In terms of chronic long-term effects, they all have significant physical effects on the body, but they also all have, effects on potentially on your mental health. I think it is often down to individual circumstance, genetics, context, affluence, who will have problematic issues with some of these substances, compared to people who may not experience any harm from taking them recreationally, but they all have propensity to lead to problematic use, and they all have propensity to lead to addiction disorders which may need treatment.
And are there any of these that we've spoken about, or any mixing in general, that are absolute no's?
So, I mean, I suppose all mixing is bad. I mean, I'm using bad in the sort of air quotes way, but it increases risk if you were to mix any of these substances. The one that I think the strongest message for in terms of reduction of overdose harm is G, and using that alongside alcohol or other sedative medications, because the risk of overdose is incredibly great due to that narrow range of G's subjective effects.
And finally, is there an age in which people should seriously consider stop doing recreational drugs, that your body can no longer handle it, your heart is a lot weaker, your brain cannot function as well? Is there a turning point in age where we should really reevaluate our relationship with them?
So, I mean, any increase in age will increase risk. Your metabolic processes change. Well, not any increase in age, but yeah, as we get older, our metabolism will change in such a way as the doses that were previously safe for us may become more unsafe because we're metabolizing them at a slower rate. I don't think there's any sort of cutoff or specific, age delineation. What I would say is that addiction can happen at any age, problematic use can happen at any age, and drug-related harm can happen at any age. Yes, it might be more likely at certain older in certain older age ranges due to changes in body physiology, but that doesn't mean it can't happen when you're young, and that doesn't mean it can't happen at any time. So I think it's not necessarily about specific time points in your life in terms of age, but there are specific time points where it may be other life events are going on which might make it more risky. So using substances in a way that is you're taking them for non-enjoyment, non-recreational purposes, or you're taking them in a different way that suddenly you're taking them, you feel like you don't have control over it anymore, or it's impacting your mental health in a negative way, or it's impacting your physical health in a negative way. That's the time to think about reevaluating your relationship with that substance and whether or not you need to reduce, modify, change, become abstinent, any and or all of the above, that might improve your overall life and well-being. I don't think, it's a specific age per se. It's an individual, it's an individual decision and things that can happen. And also, younger people can equally experience significant harm from drugs, as can older people.
When you do see people come in and they have negative consequences to these sorts of drugs, would you say that on the whole you see people experiencing psychological issues or physical issues?
It's really a mixture of both.
Right.
People walk through the door of a drug service because something has happened. They've had some kind of negative consequence occurred. Some kind of negative consequences occurred in order for them to go, this is no longer working for me, or there's something has changed and it's impacting me negatively. We have this sort of rule of thumb within the addiction world that people come to our services for what we call the 4 L's. So something has happened with their liver, or that's a sort of shortening of anything to do with their physical health. So started to get problems with my heart, or problems with my liver, or problems with my nerves, or whatever. So liver, livelihood. So something has happened in their employment. Maybe their boss has noticed that their performance has dropped, or they've had a random drug test at work, or something has happened in terms of their employment. Lover, so something has happened in one of their relationships. Someone they care for has informed them that their use is negatively impacting on them in some way, or the law. So some kind of criminal justice they've been caught drunk driving, some kind of thing has happened. So yeah, liver, lover, livelihood, and the law are, roughly speaking, the main categories of reason why people walk through the door of a drug service. But also they walk through for a whole host of reasons, individual, and I hope that, if people are struggling out there with problematic use, they feel able and they know that there are services out there that are, ready, have seen a lot of these problems before, and are full of professionals who want to help talk through issues and try and make things better.
Well, that was all really interesting. We are acknowledging that people, particularly gay men, will go out and do drugs at festivals and parties. It's not saying don't do that. It's just saying do it responsibly and know limits, know what's in things, what's the precautions, and how to do it safely.
Yeah, and that, things might turn bad, and people people develop problems and develop addictions, more often than you would think, and that appropriate help is out there. And if you're struggling with any of these issues, then I'd really encourage you to talk to some friends, see your GP, see your local drug service, or, you're not alone.
Okay, well, Dr. Emmert, thank you.
Welcome.